We will revise some words employed in philosophy, specifically in theory of knowledge, but that also have a bit part in ontology. We will revise the etymological origins, but we have to be aware that words change through the time and that this original meaning has been modified by the use and by the schools that employ these concepts. The first is object, literally means that is over there in front of you, that you see and that you find, and refers to something that is outside you, exists by itself, in itself, independently, if you know or not. Objectivity should be this state in which there is correspondence to the objects, that we remain trustful to these objects outside us. Usually we say that feelings, interests, and other things in us can modify objectivity, and that we should remain impartial to be objective. Further discussion is required here that we won't do in this moment. Subject is literally below you. What is below you or inside you is your mind, yourself. So subject is the person that knows, the person that is able to see these objects here and there, and will apprehend and will know these objects. Real comes from Latin res, think, and refers to the different things that we find here, there, over there. And that exist again outside you, independently of you. The meaning at the end is very close to object, and reality will be this quality of existing independently of you, or the aggregate of all the things that exist, that integrate the universe, for example. Image comes from a word in Latin that means a copy or imitation, a reflection of the reality. It is a representation in our mind of the objects outside us, or representation of the reality. Imaginary, on the contrary, means that exists only in your mind and therefore doesn't have a correspondence outside you. We have to be very careful because image and imaginary are two different things. Phenomenon is a very important word that comes from Greek phenomenon, and means what appears to the sight. Is related to shining or something like that, and refers not to the object that exists in itself by itself, independently of you knowing or not, but it refers to the reality as we perceive it. It means we cannot know the objects in themselves. We perceive the objects, and this perception of the things is the phenomenon. But in the phenomenon, there are two parts: the sensations that come through the senses from the object, and the interpretation the mind makes about this. The sensations doesn't have a meaning in itself. but the mind makes sense, makes meaning of all these sensations. Therefore, a phenomenon is something between the objectivity and the subjectivity. It's not that you imagine this, but also is not the reality in itself. Um, in the novel, the Sophie's World, uh, when they explain Kant, they say, well, the reality is like water, and the mind is like a recipient. Therefore, the reality will take the form of the recipient or mold. And that is the idea of phenomenon. The phenomenon is not the thing in itself, by itself, but is the thing as we can perceive. And the mind will employ some categories to make sense, to make meaning of this time, space, color, and many other things, comparison, classification, etc. All this is made by the mind to make sense or give meaning to the sensations we obtain. So, in the idea of phenomenon, we have the question that we cannot know the reality as it is. Only we can know as we perceive it. From a human point of view, a human perspective, perhaps we can suppose that at least mammals or at least apes can have a more or less uh, similar brain and mind, and perhaps we share with them, but we are not sure, of course, of this. So, what is knowledge? The Greeks differentiated between knowledge and doxa. Episteme is what we know by certainty, with certainty. Doxa is just an opinion. If we define knowledge as the truth, as something that is exact representation of the object, perhaps knowledge will be impossible, or at least is very difficult. In science, there is a more um, practical approach, and scientists understand knowledge as um, an approximation to reality, a model that can be improved and is closer and closer and closer to the reality that we can verify by factual data, but never will be the truth. In 1928, Johannes Hansen wrote that knowledge was the correspondence between the, the image and the reality. And that if there is not an exact correspondence, there is not really knowledge. I was shocked when I read this in the first year of uh, my career, uh, because even if I don't know a lot of science, I had studied in preparatory school the principle of uncertainty by Werner Heisenberg and the Schrödinger model of atom, in which we talk about probabilities. And we know that through the time, scientific knowledge had been modified, and the models that science proposed in some moment had been rejected or had been modified, and we call this knowledge. Uh, at the end, Hansen is not that uh, strict in the definition of knowledge, because he says, okay, there must be a correspondence between the image and the object. But doesn't mean that the image reflects the whole object as it is, but the part that it reflects must correspond. So it depends of the definition of knowledge in different schools of philosophy and science that we can call or not. And here we have this diagram. We have a subject, the person that knows, the object outside the person, and the representation of the reality. All what is the efforts in philosophy and science is to know if this image in our mind corresponds or not to the object outside. So the validation of knowledge is really one important part in the development of philosophy and science. In this image, in our mind, we have that different things intervene. Of course, we suppose, or we can suppose that there is an object outside us. If we can or not know as it is other problem. That Kant will say, no, we cannot know the things as they are. But we know the objects through our senses, sight, the taste, the ear, etc. We can create instruments to have more precise information about the objects and to verify what is the image we have with these uh, things that we collect. But of course, even in science, we cannot be completely objective. Even scientists individually are persons that were created in a cultural environment subjected to prejudices with a perspective, uh, cultural perspective, gender perspective, and many other things. And also what Kant called these a priori concepts that are in our mind and they are employed to make sense or to give meaning to the sensations we obtain. So time, space, and others are not in the reality. They are in our mind and they are the forms in which we perceive the objects. Scientists used to say the brain was wired by the evolution in some form and interprets the reality according to this.